to explore. Let's come back with what we heard from the Pope. Dr. Nigel Fletcher is a political historian at King's College London. Thank you for coming on, sir. What does history tell us about the involvement of senior religious figures, whether they be archbishops, whether they be the popes, in the world of politics? What should we learn from that? Doctor, good morning.
Good morning. I think what's interesting is that in Britain, as distinct from the United States, we seem content to leave religion to religious leaders. And so you would have the Archbishop of Canterbury and members of the House of Lords who are bishops opining on religious matters in our Parliament. And we don't really expect politicians and the Prime Minister to be religious leaders in that way. And I think we're quite uncomfortable when we do see politicians wearing their faith on their sleeve. It's quite unusual in a way that I don't think it is in the United States, which I think makes Donald Trump's interventions slightly different to a debate that we would have in the UK.
Similar question I put to my previous contributor, Doctor. In a perfect world, and it is anything but in a perfect world, how does a religious leader balance his or her views on political aspects that affect the lives of their flock?
Well, I think it's quite difficult, particularly given the fact that we do have an established church in the UK. We have effectively a state religion, and that's the reason that we do have bishops in the House of Lords, and so they are required to give their views on legislation as it passes through Parliament. And so, in a way, they are obliged to give views on political matters as part of their job as legislators. And that's obviously quite uncomfortable for politicians because they will have senior members of the church standing up and making statements like that. But of course there are other sort of religious leaders either in Parliament or in public life who will also make their views clear. And whilst that's uncomfortable for politicians, I think you'd have to say that it is part of their job. It is part of what they are there to do. They are leaders in a different way to politicians, but certainly they are obliged to give their views as part of their leadership in their religion. So there's always going to be that tension between them, but it's a question of, as you say, of the demarcation between what is political with a large P and what is something that they shouldn't be getting involved with. But historically, we have prime ministers, going back in history, who have clashed with church leaders, and effectively their view has always been stick to your lane.
So to the Pope yesterday, lastly, if we can, Doctor, should he have stuck to his lane? Was it appropriate where he went with his comments? Did he step over a line, Doctor?
I don't think so. I think that certainly with regard to his leadership of the Catholic Church, this is a world religion that crosses international boundaries. He's not simply sitting there as a leader of a religious organisation in the United States and criticising Donald Trump specifically. He has a global role, and I think that Donald Trump, not unusually sees it as being all about him. But I think that the Pope has been quite clear in trying to say that he's not specifically talking about one person. He may, of course, have his own views on that. But I think the Pope is in a particular position because of that, enormously significant world role that he has as the leader of the Catholic Church. And that's, I think, becoming more difficult for Trump and for the United States, because for the first time we have an American Pope, and it's being seen in that way. But I think that it's very difficult when you have a political leader sort of telling the Pope to use the phrase we just have to stay in his lane, and J.D. Vance sort of criticising him on religious terms. I mean, I really don't think that this is an area that any British politician would ever want to get into.
Doctor, I will leave it there. Thank you. Nigel Fletcher, you're a political historian at King's College London. Thank you for your input. The world is being ravaged by a handful of tyrants. That says the Pope. Meanwhile, Trump says Pope Leo is weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy.